My name's David Lee. My job is simply just to guide us through the proceedings today. It is a real pleasure to be involved in this inaugural Impact programme. This is the fourth lecture panel that we've hosted so far, following previous sessions on quantum, on risk and on the circular economy. I've also worked with two groups of professors on podcasts around the built environment and on around women in mathematics, and please give them a listen. They are available online and they are genuinely pretty good. The podcasts and lecture panels, along with Pizza with the Prof and the other things that Steve described, are part of this move to presenting the impact of the work of Heriot-Watt University and its professors in a range of different ways and a range of different media to suit the different ways that we choose to consume information or pizzas in 2023. A couple of housekeeping points. There's no fire alarm planned. You can see pretty clearly where the exits are. The toilets, you know, are sort of out and to the right, and refreshments. I'm told there will be canapes served afterwards, so if you do slope off early, you won't get any of them. So what's going to happen is we're going to hear from each of our three professors for about 15 minutes each, talking about their specific expertise around the broad theme of how can we best advance inclusion and accessibility in higher education. After we've heard from each of them, we'll move on to the panel discussion and develop some of the significant themes raised by their presentations. I'll ask some questions and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions too. And there's one of these big, weird sort of foam microphones that will be kind of passed around. If you do want to ask a question, as soon as the panel session starts, stick your hand up early so I can see who wants to come in, and we'll try and bring in as many people as possible. So, without further ado, can you please join me, in 6 minutes ahead of schedule, which is amazing, can you please join me in welcoming Martha Caddell, who is Professor of Higher Education Policy and Practice Director of the Learning and Teaching Academy. Martha, over to you.
So, good afternoon, colleagues. It's a deceptively simple question we're posing today. How can we extend accessing and inclusion in higher education? How can we support more and more diverse students to step into university study? And we could give a fairly straightforward answer. There's a wealth of research on what works for access and inclusion. There's checklists and examples of interventions that can make a difference to students. Supported transitions and induction. Oh, okay. No? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yep, there we go. Okay. Okay, so we could give a fairly straightforward answer. There's a wealth of research on what works for access and inclusion. There's checklists and examples of interventions that can make a difference to students. Supported transitions and an induction, a focus on peer mentoring, programmes to build confidence as students step into higher education. And there's a raft of policy and potential action in this space, globally and nationally. Here in the Scottish context, for example, we've the Blueprint for Fairness, the report, recommendations and targets from the Commission on Widening Access. But we don't need to scratch the surface very far to see that the discussion of participation, access and inclusion takes us into areas that are contested practically, pedagogically and politically. As the quote here suggests, the access agenda is not just about supporting students into university, but it's about presenting and championing a particular vision of inclusion and whose participation counts, a particular vision of Scotland's education system, and indeed a particular vision of Scotland as a nation itself. So advancing access and inclusion isn't just about meeting targets or a quota of participation. It's about appreciating and arguably reimagining what and who counts, who's valued and privileged in contemporary higher education. So to explore this, I'd like to home in on the metaphors of access and aspiration that shape policy, And I'd like to explore the language that we use to open up new ways of understanding our actions and options. So let's think of the words that we use when we talk about widening participation. Learner journeys, access to learning, routes to degrees, pathways to learning, barriers to participation, bridging programmes, the uneven terrain of social mobility. You'll be able to think of many more, I'm sure. And it's striking that the spatial and geographical imagery that's become so ubiquitous in our educational planning and action that we rarely pause to think about it. So of course, landscape, space and place really does matter in real and tangible ways. The nation you live in determines the fees you pay and the learning experience you might have. Postcodes are used to designate relative deprivation and frame interventions. Mobility or lack of it can have a real bearing on the education opportunities that can be accessed. So exploring that interplay between the language we use and the lived realities of learners opens up space for us to reflect on and maybe challenge our thinking and our practice, to rework and adapt when required, to reject where they limit our creativity, and to amplify when they increase our ability to support diverse learners. So I'd like to introduce 3 snapshots, 3 metaphors of access that I'm drawing from my portfolio of research, scholarship and action-focused work. Work that's been characterised and unified by my interest in exploring the creative spaces between politics, policy and pedagogic change. From my research on education in the context of civil war and political conflict in Nepal, and on education and development more broadly. From my interest in championing the experience of mature and part-time learners in the UK context and the development of flexible curriculum frameworks, and driving the Scotland-wide conversation on fair and accessible internships for university students. And from my current work exploring academic identities, ideas of prestige and excellence, and of course, my championing of learning and teaching enhancement and support for educational leadership. So, snapshot 1. It takes us to a village in rural Nepal. A mother, Maya, explains to me the choices she's making about which of her children to send to school. She wants to ensure that, they have outward-looking eyes. They're able to travel beyond the village to become a doctor or an engineer. Her son will go to the English medium school, but she can't afford to send her daughter there. She'll go to the government school and be taught in Nepali. The idea of education as a route to something beyond the local dominated much of the imagery of the textbooks and the vision of the nation presented in the school curriculum. It framed the medium of instruction. In one school, despite all but 2 of the children only speaking at Pariarai language, the teachers only spoke Nepali. The classroom was physically open to the students, but the possibilities for communication and learning were exceptionally limited. And what outward-looking meant for those groups was contested. For Maya, it meant opening opportunities for mobility beyond the village, for an imagined future of greater prosperity for her children. But in the context of the Maoist People's War, which was raging at the time, schools became a literal battleground for promoting alternative views of the Nepali nation, alternative views of who and what education was for. Schools also experienced a revolving door of missionaries, aid agencies, political parties and more seeking to promote particular ways of learning, particular understandings and approaches to participation. So what relevance does that have for our current Heriot-Watt context? That central motif that was so dominant in the context of education and political conflict in Nepal, the question of what and whose knowledge counts, is pivotal to much of our current debate on access and inclusion. We see critical discourse across the sector about inclusive curriculum, the language that we use in our classrooms, the voices we amplify in our curriculum, the very histories of our disciplines, and how that informs what we teach and what we research. And that's a theme that Minhyong is going to be exploring in much more detail later in this panel. And we see it in how we value different forms of knowledge and experience. For example, how we centre experiential and work-based knowledge, how we value it and integrate it into our educational offer, our systems and our processes, is a challenge that we continue to grapple with here at Heriot-Watt and across the sector. The second snapshot I would like to unpack is perhaps the most ubiquitous metaphor we see in the widening access landscape, the learner journey and the associated travel metaphors that dominate a lot of our discussions. So throughout the Blueprint for Fairness, for example, we see a focus on bridges as a key signifier used to emphasise the importance of creating links between points in the education landscape. Articulation and direct entry from college, and a changed relationship between schools and universities. So pushing that metaphor a little bit further, forgive me, we can begin to reimagine the relationships and opportunities we might want to create. Our three bridges here might help with that. We have, of course, the rail bridge of access, those well-worn routes and traditional routes into university, a strong heritage and strong voices wishing to ensure they're preserved. We've got slightly more modern routes, newer forms of transport, more diverse starting points and more diverse destinations they can take us through with the first of the road bridges. But the cracks might be beginning to show as the journey and the number of people travelling that route increases, and the maintenance costs may become too high. And then we see new routes being opened to circumvent the congestion and perhaps to offer with a particular focus on speeding up progression. And we might want to consider what's missing in this imagining. What happens on these routes if you want to pause? You want to stop or you want to turn around? How easy is it to get help if your journey doesn't go quite as you want to plan? And what's happening at either end of these bridges? The focus on connecting points limits our understanding of the impact on communities at either end. So think, for example, of students entering in year 2 of studies, the impact on the group as a whole, and the support needed not just for the travellers, but for those who were already present. And what about onward destinations? Access and success also requires us to think about fair and equitable opportunities to connect and thrive in work and community beyond the university space. So, do we need to construct our bridges, our support for learners differently? Can we focus not just on the fastest and most direct route, and not just on unidirectional transitions? Rather, like on a Ponte Vecchio-style bridge, can we create the opportunities for mixing and blending learning opportunities, for mixing with others, sharing experience and knowledges? And here we'd have the option to backtrack, to access services and support along the way, and to speed up our journeys when required. How we work with the idea of a bridge into university can significantly shift what opportunities we focus on and develop for learners. And of course, this isn't just a linguistic nicety. It's exactly the challenges we're facing here in the Scottish context as we seek to shape a tertiary approach to post-school learning. We're at a critical juncture where we need to both challenge the idea of learner journeys as framed solely by straight lines and high-speed transitions, with the practical realities of the fees, the fares, and the tariffs that the journey encounters. The connections we imagine and construct now are going to have lasting impact on our educational landscape. The final metaphor I'd like to explore is the idea of learning community and the drive to ensure students and staff feel they belong in a university context. The common usage of these terms doesn't imply common understanding of what we mean by belonging. In relation to the student experience, there's been a whole host of work, for example, on how belonging is experienced, not always positively, by apprentices, online learners, international students, students from care experience backgrounds and more. And the actions that can help to help build the practical connections and support that will make a difference. And there's a lot of work on the practical steps we can take in pedagogic practice to appreciate the diversity of student backgrounds, interests and aspirations and build that into a positive and inclusive learning experience. But the snapshot I want to focus on here is on the staff experience, and it draws on my current work on programme leadership in the Scottish and UK sector and the balancing act that staff in those roles play in their everyday work. Supporting inclusive education, guiding diverse students into and through a programme of study isn't straightforward. It requires time and space to build connections with students, with the communities that they're embedded in. It requires careful course and programme design, developing, engaging, and ensuring that there's inclusive learning activities. And it requires time to network across and beyond an institution to build a web of support that will make a difference to particular students. So many of the programme leaders that were involved in the studies noted that being able to make a tangible and direct impact on students' lives provided them with a sense of reward, joy even, in their role. But the flip side of that was the institutional challenges that they felt in being able to deliver this. The lack of power they felt to make change happen, the lack of reward and recognition for work that they felt was fundamental to the university mission. And for many, the lack of prestige that they felt this work was given. In institutions driven by indicators of research excellence and esteem and the competing demands that placed on individuals' time. So, putting a spotlight on building inclusive learning communities challenges institutions to explore more inclusive ways of valuing the skills and the expertise of those who shape the communities, academic and professional services staff. So widening access requires a whole community perspective. It has to infuse how we value staff time in workload modelling, how we support development of capabilities in learning and teaching, and how we frame and celebrate impact in staff promotions, how we ensure staff feel they belong and are empowered to support student learning. So, a whistle-stop tour through the landscape of access and inclusion. 3 snapshots of the language and the lived realities of activity to widen participation. So what are the takeaways? Firstly, an appreciation of the power and the politics that infuses discussions of access and inclusion. These are often masked by the language, where the metaphors and the imagining hides the contested nature of what is and what could be. Secondly, we need to look beyond the blueprints for action, the targets, the points on the map that we need to get to understand the richness of contexts and communities of learners. We need to appreciate and connect from the diverse experience and knowledge, even if, especially if, that means challenging some of our existing orthodoxies. And finally, widening access and creating inclusive learning is a whole institution endeavour. It takes us to the heart of the debate about the purpose of our universities, a debate we need to surface and embrace. And it opens up to scrutiny how and what ideas and activity is prioritised across a whole institution. From the curriculum that we offer, the community connections we prioritise, how staff effort is recognised and rewarded. And these are not easy takeaways to enact, particularly as Jill's going to explore further in a global institution like ours. but they are vital to embrace if we're to step beyond the rhetoric of access and inclusion and truly open up for scrutiny what and who our universities are for, and to truly commit to being spaces for diversity of thought, diversity of people, and diversity of ideas. Thank you very much, and I think it's a good point to hand over to Jill.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to carry on with some of the themes that Martha's been speaking about this afternoon. But first, I wanted to start off with a little bit about myself. I grew up in a small town in Ayrshire in the west of Scotland and was the first in my family to go to university. My favourite subject at school was chemistry, and when I asked my favourite teacher, a science teacher in the world, what I could do with this subject, he told me, "The world's your oyster." So, literally he said that. So I went to study pure and applied chemistry at Strathclyde University, and when I was getting ready for this talk, I don't know what it says about me that I still have the ruler that I got on the open day to Strathclyde. But now I've been at Heriot-Watt for over 27 years. And my initial research interests focused on the application of computer simulation to investigate crystallisation and surface processes in engineering applications, including the application to pharmaceuticals, processing and dyes and pigments. During my time here, I've been involved in teaching various aspects of chemical engineering, including environmental science and sustainability. And as I turned to focus more on learning and teaching throughout my career, I've worked on the development of teaching sustainability in higher education, encouraging students to think about the wider implications of their engineering decisions. I've been interested in widening access and participation throughout my career at Heriot-Watt. This initially included work within my discipline area to encourage females to consider engineering, and widened out to many outreach projects promoting STEM subjects and supporting widening access through working with college partners and organisations such as LEAPS during a long period as admissions tutor in chemical engineering. In January 2020, I had the opportunity to apply for and was appointed as one of the associate principals, specifically for access and inclusion, and this role supports our deputy principal, education and student life, in the delivery of the university's strategy. I've always felt really strongly that the focus needs to be on the individual and not on target numbers, and that we need to concentrate on support throughout the entire student timeline. So the intention of our strategy is to encompass access, inclusivity and participation in the widest possible sense, focusing not merely on numbers but on the support and the success of all our students, whatever pathway they choose to follow. This allows us to implement and deliver the strategy according to our ethos of One Heriot-Watt, and I'll come back to this later. I work very closely in this role with our widening participation and outreach teams, and this has led to the creation of a practitioner group which brings together colleagues from across all our 5 campuses, across all areas of the university. And I see some of them here this afternoon. And if anyone else would be interested in joining our group, please feel free to let me know after the panel. This work and the sharing of practice between staff and students not only benefits students from an access background, but also helps support the learning experience of all our students across the university. So when asking the question, what do we need to do in higher education to best advance inclusion and access, the overarching aim has to be for access, inclusion and participation. The general premise is that all should be able to enter further or higher education if they want to do so, regardless of background. Research shows that children as young as the age of 7 are already forming stereotypes and opinions on their future and possible career paths based on factors including race, gender and socio-economic status. In Scotland, the term widening participation refers to specific groups from disadvantaged backgrounds. At the core of this is that young people and mature students from the most deprived areas are supported to achieve their aspirations into, through and beyond higher education. But the broader view of widening access and participation encompasses both disadvantaged and underrepresented groups, embracing all aspects of equality, equity, diversity and inclusion. To support this in a holistic, connected way, we need to focus on the whole student life cycle that Martha mentioned to help provide an inclusive in student experience. The goal is to help students meet their basic needs to feel that they belong, are valued and can engage and want to engage. Consequently, the ways we support them are diverse and varied and require not only looking at the whole student journey, but importantly working as a whole institution and working from a whole institution perspective, involving academics, professional services and students. From an educational viewpoint, we need to consider what is the purpose of higher education. It involves cultivating skills beyond technical knowledge of individual disciplines, developing skills for lifelong learning, resilience and professional practice, among many more. This requirement was also highlighted in the work of Line several years ago. What do our students need to be able to do in the world? What do we want them to be able to do in the world? Wider skills are increasing in demand, and employers are seeking change makers, as well as those who can adapt to change. Critical evaluation and application of information, solving problems through collaboration with people from different backgrounds, and combining technological know-how with human values are all to the fore. And so what are the learning and teaching practices that we need to provide to support this? As we see an increasingly diverse population of students entering higher education institutions, there's a growing imperative that we create an environment where they feel able to access, engage with, and also contribute to their learning experience and the development of their skills. Research has found that students with awarding gaps... The things just fall out. I'll find the magnet, sorry. There we go. Seamless. Research has found that students with awarding gaps have been shown to be at a disadvantage as soon as they enter university. The impact of societal, economic and cultural capital in their learning is often underestimated. And to compound this, many students feel they don't belong and they don't see themselves reflected in either the staff or the curriculum. Education that allows students to play an active role in their learning helps to form an inclusive community, while clear assessment instructions and marking criteria make assessments accessible to students from different cultural backgrounds. The impact of role models and mentors on addressing awarding gaps are evident, with support networks known to improve student retention and success. Placing people with lived experience at the heart, empowering and not concentrating on a deficit approach, supporting and empowering learners. The core of provision needs to be inclusive, ideally from the start, and to provide an environment where all students can flourish and reach whatever their success looks like. This means having a better understanding of the diversity of our student population, understanding the barriers and challenges that our students face and not working in silos within our institution. This goes back to the importance of a whole institution viewpoint involving all stakeholders. Some of this must be tackled at institutional level, but much of it sector-wide. The ideal is to fix the issue itself, fix the system, and think about addressing structural inequalities. We're seeing increasing intersectionality and a greater recognition of the importance of language in supporting a sense of belonging. For example, across the sector, we've seen a large increase in care experienced and estranged students, and we need to reevaluate assumptions of home and family life. Work at several institutions has focused on key groups of intersectionality and looking at changes in attainment following specific initiatives. So common aspects have included some of the things we see here, authentic and varied assessment which supports diverse learning styles, greater use of inclusive role models from within staff and industry, and universal design for learning. It's been clearly noted that no one change has impact. A range of interventions is always and usually required. This allows all to gain different skills and is more inclusive as the focus is on different strengths rather than one type of learning, one type of assessment. So to accomplish this, students must be involved in all we plan and do. Their voices and their involvement is crucial. Being inclusive through design involves this co-creation. Earlier this year, the Commission for Fair Access Scotland stated that progress has been made toward meeting the ambitious 2030 target to widen access, but the world in which we live has changed. The COVID pandemic and now the cost of living crisis have intensified the problems for those already facing most disadvantage. And although this has a Scottish focus, this impact can be seen globally and is further impacting from an intersectionality perspective. So is it time to rethink expectations of students around hours of study, volume of assessment, scheduling of assessment, timetabling, format and mode of teaching, length of degrees? We could go on. The considerations of this are wide. I just wanted to show you this quote from a piece of research done quite recently. The new widening participation typology consists of raising aspirations, fair admission and retention, flexible progression, outreach partners, vocational emphasis, flexible delivery. You can see that the groups have changed over time, but the attention has shifted from recruitment and admission to retention, on-course support and access to equitable career opportunities. So highlighting that whole process of coming into university but going on into the working world. Teachers will be encouraged to become learning facilitators and students will have more influence over their own learning. Tomorrow's classrooms will need to emphasise a mix of student engagement in learning, inquiry-based techniques, curiosity, imagination and design thinking. In this context, it can be challenging to get high-level support for groups where no targets or focus from the government is provided. At this year's keynote address at University's UK Access and Participation Conference, John Blake, the Director for Fair Access and Participation at the Office for Students, said, "Only focusing on metrics incentivised practices that were not in the best interest of students. Focus solely on the metrics and not on the outcome or the impact." Funding needs to be sustainable. We cannot rely on fixed-term funding to provide the solutions. We need to be in a position where support and initiatives embarked upon are business as usual, both within our higher education institutions and in the wider sector, to have tangible impact. There are challenges in creating a framework for action to widen access that works across a breadth of national contexts. So as a global institution with 5 campuses in 3 countries, the question is how to shape and frame policy, student support and pedagogy to facilitate access and success in ways that are meaningful and practically realisable in all these contexts. Our overarching strategy sets out strategic ambitions for access and inclusion across the following areas of raising aspirations, inclusive admissions and supporting student success. In keeping with available research, our approach is to provide support across the whole student journey, from entry all the way through to graduation and beyond into employment, enabling students to thrive and fulfil their potential. Effective access and inclusion requires more than getting students from underrepresented and disadvantaged groups into university. We need to provide support that ensures these students can progress through their studies and realise their career aspirations and their own goals. We're working to provide a holistic, global, integrated approach, hopefully tailored to fit the needs of the different countries in which we operate. This must be considerate of well-being of all those involved, of all staff, of all students, and be mindful of very mindful of the challenges our students are facing, making sure that they're getting the most out of the experience. Working in partnership across the university with students and staff has allowed this wider viewpoint to have greater reach. So how do we support diverse student groups? And how do we do this from a global perspective that is one Heriot-Watt? We need to implement measures collectively and consistently, while recognising the differences that may occur due to changing focus in government perspectives, cultural aspects and legal requirements. There is a political challenge in developing our conceptual position and then, more importantly, practically operationalising this. Here we face a multitude of challenges related to policy, politics and financial realities, with metrics driving action in many areas. And as we heard earlier, the focus on metrics often causes its own difficulties. Our global outlook is inherent in what we do, and where these differences occur, it's possible to consider what are the similarities and what are the parallels, and what aspects might we be unable to reconcile and need to accept. For example, our Global programme provides amazing opportunities for many of our students to study across our campuses, allowing mobility for those who wish to take the opportunity, often supported by available bursaries. But it's also important that we provide globally relevant experiences for those who don't wish to or are unable to travel. The barriers faced here are not only financial. A Go Global experience for all. For example, through virtual placements, cross-campus projects, ideally with the involvement of industrial partners. Leading from an academic viewpoint has demonstrated the importance of the student perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the step change is to not be merely focused on achieving numerical targets, but be driven by a wider purpose to support student success throughout the whole process. Several initiatives have been put in place across our campuses to raise aspirations. These are some pictures here from all our campuses of some outreach work that's going on. And they help to raise aspirations, facilitate entry into higher education and support our students during their studies. And there are many other examples across the university of fantastic initiatives such as our Maths Gym, our WP student ambassadors and the enhanced support provision. It's imperative that we assist staff, Martha mentioned this, in exploring and reflecting on the opportunities and challenges of implementing inclusivity and accessibility into their courses, and to provide a basis from which any changes can begin. It's also important to continually review steps being taken across our institution and identify areas where further change, resources and support may be needed, with a focus on enhancement and on co-creation. This is just an example of one of our curriculum design, or the curriculum design toolkit that we have in the university to help support staff in this. And finally, our global access and inclusion strategy is driving our approach to widening participation in the broadest possible ways. Our aspiration is to be a place where a student's ethnicity, gender, disability or social background presents no barriers to them realising their potential, where they're empowered to thrive and where they feel they can belong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Gillian and to Martha. There's a lot raised by the two talks there, so I do hope you've got your questions ready. So much to think about. Our final speaker before we move to the discussion section is Professor Minhyong Kim, who is Director of the International Centre of Mathematical Sciences. Minhyong, over to you.
Thank you very much. As you can guess from the name of the institution that I'm managing at the moment, most of my thought processes and concern is about mathematical research. So compared to the previous speakers, I have very little expertise on the theme that concerns us today. Nonetheless, it's something very, very close to my heart at the moment, both at the level of political consciousness in a general sense, but actually also research. And I hope I have something to say today that might be of interest and relevance and maybe even use to the university exactly as a global institution. I'm so glad that the two previous speakers, Jill and Martha, called attention to this global identity in such a prominent manner. So I'm actually going to try to answer the question that's in the title, and I think I know the answer. So you can try to prepare your own. So I'll start with this quote that I think many people articulate in their own way, and I think everybody would agree with this. So let me read it. I won't read too many of these slides in the literal sense, but maybe this one will take a moment. So this is Kamran Vafa. He's a very distinguished mathematical physicist, and he said, "Science is a timeless, borderless adventure. If we take a snapshot of science today, we'll see various centers of excellence, some places that may be relatively quiet. But we should view this not as the property of science, but as transient phenomena. Sometimes science is strong in one place, sometimes in the other. It's not a territory of a particular area, and it's not the territory of a particular people. It's an adventure for the entire humankind." Again, I don't think anybody would disagree with this. Right? However, the degree of conviction with which one articulates such a sentence depends a lot on what we know, our assumptions, and the cultural baggage that we carry. So let me try to illustrate two things. One, I'll give you a very brief example of the kind of thing that Vafa was referring to in that quote, and then move on to the difficulties that are involved in really believing this. So what I'm referring to here, we don't have to do too much mathematics, it's a single slide, of something called the Babylonian algorithm, that's what it's usually called. And it stems, the name stems, I think, from this tablet that's possibly from 1800 to 1600 BC. It's hard to date these things exactly. This is from the Yale Babylonian collection. And in the cuneiform symbols on that tablet is indicated a very accurate approximation to the square root of pi. Remarkably accurate by today's standard. It was done in sexagesimals, but anyways, it translated into numbers. We're familiar now, that's what they did. And it's quite remarkable that they made such an accurate calculation. And people believe that there was this algorithm for doing this. It's hard to know exactly when this was really written down, but nonetheless, this is known as the Babylonian algorithm, and it may have been used to calculate that accurate value. Subsequent generations of people have really refined and to generalize this algorithm. I'm just I've written down here a haphazard collection of names, right, of people from all over the world, over the centuries or millennia, who have worked on this problem in various ways. Right? And I have just that collection of names will give you a sense of the global nature of the effort. From the viewpoint of a mathematical researcher, the story comes to an end, or some kind of an end, in the 21st century, in fact, in a research paper by 3 people in America, Hubbard, Schleicher, and Sutherland. So they wrote a paper called How to Find All the Roots of Complex Polynomials by Newton's Method. This was in 2001. It's a beautiful paper involving quite technical modern mathematics, but the beauty is a little bit illustrated by this picture that appears in their paper, which is very relevant actually to this discussion, although I won't have time to go into this today. But the point I'm trying to make by giving you these names and showing you this endpoint is that this is really an effort that went on for 4,000 years, about at least between 3,000 and 4,000 years, collective research from people all around the world. That's what it means for all this, mathematics, science in general, to be an effort of the whole world, whose center moves around, of course, sometimes. Some places are more active than others. But nonetheless, the whole span of what we have is a result of the world, or a heritage of the world. There are some misconceptions surrounding this. So that's what I'll go on to discuss now. And it has very much to do with the question of identities. That was the second part of my title, right? So let me show you an image of somebody who illustrates this question reasonably well. This is Abu Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni, who is sometimes regarded as the most important scholar of what we call the Middle Ages. And he, for example, used the previous algorithm to calculate very precisely the radius of the Earth. So he used other tools as well, but one ingredient was very likely to have been that square root algorithm. He calculated the radius of the Earth to within 1% accuracy. Now, if you look at that image, you'll notice there's a postage stamp, right? And where was it published, or where was it produced? Yes. Soviet Union, more precisely, not Russia. That's that. But in Cyrillic letters, it looks to us like CCCP. That's what we would write as USSR, right? That's so produced in the Soviet Union. So when I'm giving this as a lecture for students, I like to prod them a little bit. Why do you think this was produced in the Soviet Union? Actually, I don't have that much time, but maybe I'll ask. Do you know why it was produced in the Soviet Union? No guesses? Yes, why were they claiming him so?
Because he was in a part of Iran that's close to Russia.
That's a very good guess. Not exactly correct, but close enough. I'll give you some kind of a prize later. Anyways, so he was born in a region called Khorazm, which is in present-day Uzbekistan, which then was part of the Soviet Union. And officially, so the Soviet government was just as interested as we were in diversity and promoting the multicultural nature of the Union. Now, one question that I would like to ask then, with regard to this picture is, so what should we call this person? Was he a Uzbek? Now, this seems like an anachronism of some sort. There was no Uzbekistan at that time, clearly, right? But nonetheless, I will remind you, and I don't give you example right now, but there are lots of labeling of historical figures that we take for granted that are just as ridiculous as calling him an Uzbek. Was he Iranian? In fact, many people argue this very strenuously, that he belonged to the Persian civilization, right? Or was he Arabic? I'll say more about that particular idea, that possible identification in a little while. So there are many, many misconceptions about people's identity of people from the distant past. So here's another passage from a book by Alfred North Whitehead, An Introduction to Mathematics. And so this is a paragraph. It's astounding when I read it. It's almost wrong in every single part. It's essentially, but what's surprising is that this was regarded, he was an important intellectual, of course, an important philosopher and made important contribution. Nonetheless, he can throw off a completely wrong idea like this, right, with almost no ground whatsoever. First of all, the death of Archimedes itself is a mythology that he's presenting as history, with very few ancient sources to back it up. Nonetheless, let's examine just a few aspects of what he's saying, right? So, for example, one question that's brought up by assertions of this sort, that's more or less taken for granted when you are making an assertion of this sort, is this question of why there were no Roman mathematicians. This is a common stereotype that, in fact, Greeks has all these mathematicians, there were no Romans. And I found this very, very curious. By the way, there is a definite answer to this question. Yeah. You don't have to theorize. So people start talking about, again, as Whitehead did, Romans were practical people, Greeks were theoretical people, etc., nonsense like that. But anyways, so here are some mathematicians of the Roman Empire: Heron, Ptolemy, Diophantus. These are just among the most distinguished names. There are many, many others that are not listed that I don't know too well myself. So why do people say there were no Roman mathematicians? And the answer is actually very simple. They're actually defined out of existence. Many people who practiced mathematics in the Roman Empire were simply regarded as not being Roman by people like Whitehead. Here's another assertion there that I would like to query a little bit. Why were Greeks and Romans, ancient Greeks and Romans, leaders of the European world? Let's see. I mean, so this is a very complicated question. To give it full treatment would take many, many hours, right? But let's just look briefly at what Aristotle had to say about this in the 4th century BCE, right? Essentially, he's trying to characterize in his politics the difference between some people around the world, in particular Europe and Asia. So what he says here is that people in Europe are very spirited, but they're not very smart. People in Asia are smart, but they lack in spirit, so they always remain as slaves. But Greeks, being in the middle, they're perfect. So that's what he's trying to say. So whatever you think about the stereotypes that he's peddling here, he clearly didn't regard Greece as part of what he called Europe, right? So this idea also evolves over the millennia, but it's clearly a complicated question, at least, to accept the idea that Greeks and Romans were leaders of the European world. What does that possibly mean? If you examine the case of Rome, this is the Roman Empire in the early 2nd century. This is what it is in the 7th century. Okay? So why were they leaders of the European world? Does this make sense whatsoever? It seems at least as strange as the idea that Al-Biruni was Uzbek, right? So these are the misconceptions that we seem to live with. And here's an example of why it's such a serious issue. So this was this is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, 1785. And what he's trying to say here is that blacks are incapable of doing mathematics. That's what he argues in this note. And as you say, as I've quoted here, he says he can't imagine a black person following the investigations of Euclid. Now, this is also a very, very strange assertion because, in fact, nobody knows anything about Euclid's ethnicity. We hardly know whether this was a man or a woman or a collective, or if such a person existed. Certainly, we know nothing about the person's life or ethnicity. But almost all ancient authors are agreed that Euclid probably lived in Africa. So by what stretch of the imagination is Jefferson regarding himself as closer to Euclid, well, than a random black person? Yeah? Well, here you go. So this is the kind of assumption that I'm referring to as misconceptions about identity when we think about history, especially ancient history. This is typical of many mathematicians of the ancient world. Thales lived in present-day Turkey. Pythagoras was born in Samos, but all the sources say he lived and studied all around the Mediterranean. Eratosthenes was born and lived in present-day Libya. And as I said, these three characters were born in present-day Egypt. Where do these misconceptions come from? There are many, many sources, including a lot of identity politics in Europe in the 18th and 19th century. But here's a small sample of the way people come up with these identifications. So this was a very well-received book that came out a few years ago. And Roderick Beaton, the author, is very aware, actually, of these controversies, right? So he gives a definition in order to clear up any possible confusion. He says, the Greeks of the title and the pages that follow are to be understood as speakers of the Greek language. Well, there's a definition, so he's allowed to use any definition he wants. But of course, when we employ a definition, we are typically arguing that this is a reasonable definition. So that's one possible criticism you could levy against this passage. But the other problem is that, in fact, most of the people appearing in this book, we have no idea what language they spoke. What we have is a few extant works from that period and guesses about what the language of that work might mean. So, for example, that Al-Biruni character from earlier on, his works were all written in Arabic. So from that point, from Roderick Beaton's point of view, he certainly should be identified as Arabic, right? Not Persian or anything else, right? And most of you will know that Newton's major works were written in Latin. There you go. So he's a Roman mathematician. Right? There you go. And many mathematicians, or most mathematicians around the world, and many people in this room will be identified in a future book on the global history of the English. This is what we write in. Right? So well, curiously enough, when I pointed this out, so recently I've been having a lot of interaction with ancient historians, and when I point out this last thing, that in fact, according to this common classification and definition, we would all be classified as English. This seems to surprise a lot of ancient historians. Somehow this doesn't seem to have occurred to many people. I'm very surprised that they're surprised. So, so this is another silly thing that a famous mathematician, G.H. Hardy, said in a well-received book. This is a book that's very popular as a picture of a mathematician's perspective. And it's a very silly book in many ways, but it contains silly characterizations like this as well. So what's the conclusion? What am I trying to say? Well, clearly, first of all, this is a kind of a side remark rather than a conclusion. So Whitehead lived in a cultural milieu where some Europeans, well, what we mean by European is also very, very complicated, right? But they had claimed that ancient Greco-Roman tradition, simply by embracing and studying it. And attaching it to identity politics, which I can't go into here. This is, of course, very, very common. People create their tradition out of what they admire from the past. And sometimes if they don't like their previous predecessor, they go to the distant past to look for identity. This is another common ploy, right, in the formation of political identity, for example. So the answer to the question I posed in the title is that mathematics and the mathematical tradition now, it belongs, in fact, to whomever studies and uses it. Because that's what they did, what Europeans, for example, in the 18th and 19th century, did exactly this and claimed the Greco-Roman tradition, for example, among other things, to be their own. Anybody can do this right now, but if we want to say this with conviction, if we want to convince our students, for example, that the mathematical tradition belongs to them, we have to free ourselves from some of these ancient preconceptions coming, say, for example, from the 19th century. Fortunately, the academic world of historians have long since moved on. The world of ancient history and even classics, which is a very conservative subject, has changed tremendously in the last 50 years. And nobody uses the kind of silly stereotypes that Whitehead expresses in his book anymore. But in fact, the academic culture that belongs to, say, a mathematician who might be in the classroom talking to students still has a lot to catch up on. We're quite behind the times when it comes to having an accurate understanding of what history was, what the history of our subject was, and what the identity of ancient people were. Right? So there's a lot of effort, people doing interesting research all over the world. The leading research is very much concerned with getting more accuracy on the kind of questions we've discussed today. At the ICMS, we're also hosting workshops that try to discuss and clarify these issues. I also had a workshop where I work part-time on this theme at the Korea Institute for Advanced Study in Seoul. And this is part of a much larger umbrella project at the ICMS that goes under the name of Mathematics for Humanity. Right? I'm not going to here to advertise that program today, except in that small part concerned with identity and history, but I hope some of you will be interested. Look up our website and find out what this is about. Thank you very much.
Well, that was quite the journey for a Wednesday afternoon, wasn't it? What a lot. A brief history of mathematics in you only took 18 minutes, so we'll give you the extra 3 minutes.
Oh, sorry about that.
That was allowed. Yeah, I don't know, just linking the 3 presentations together, I guess Minhyong at the end is really saying, when we think about access and inclusion, we're not just thinking about the here and now, we're thinking about everything of where we've come from. Indeed. And where, how that sense of belonging has developed over this huge kind of sweep of time. So if anybody wants to stick your hand if you've got any questions, I've got a few questions to begin with. If we can get the first microphone down here, please. Anyone on this side got a question so we can get the microphone there? And another microphone at the front if we can get one as well. I'm just going to ask our speakers one question each. First of all, I'm just going to come back to you, Martha. When you're talking about those learner journeys, and is it difficult when, first of all, traditional pathways are so well established in universities, and how do you offer those individualized learner journeys in an era of, as Jill said, numbers and metrics, and without an institution becoming chaotic? How do you offer that individualized experience while holding the whole together in an organizational way? And if I can ask all of you to lean into the mics when you're answering, just so everybody can hear well.
It's a really interesting question, and it's an issue that I guess many of us in the room are grappling with on a day-to-day basis. So I think the expertise is in the room around some of this. But I think it's the issues are really encapsulated by what level of flexibility and what level of certainty we want to offer. So when we talk about individualized learner journeys, or we have to be kind of very circumspect about what degree of flexibility we want to offer. So when we were developing the flexible curriculum toolkit, for example, it was thinking about, if you flex in one dimension, what do you have to hold solid in another place? So if we're saying you can study and start your study at any time you like, you might need to make sure that there are certain fixed points in terms of what you study. If you're thinking about actually you can come in with different entry requirements, then you need to be thinking about what's the support that you're putting in place. So when we talk about individualized learner journeys, it isn't a free-for-all. It has to be about thinking about the support and all of the stuff that Jill was talking about wraparound support around students, so that it's not whatever journey you choose, it's the journey that's going to give you the most support to get to your destination in the kind of best and most supported way possible.
Okay, Jill, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that, but also a bit more of a question about when you were talking about staff, and I think both of you talked about getting staff to look outside that immediate experience. And you were talking about a huge amount of change around rethinking timetabling, assessment, the whole format of teaching. Obviously, a lot of people who are teaching in universities now have got a lot on their everyday plates. So how do you get that buy-in to really challenging what we do now and trying to look at it in that broader context and get people to lift their heads from the everyday? Again, coming back to us working very much in this era of numbers and metrics and KPIs. Sorry, that's quite a big question, I'm sorry.
And that's quite far away. I think it links to as well to what Martha was saying about the valuing that input. I think we have to recognise, and I think it's part of, I mentioned about the whole university perspective and the fact that all stakeholders have to be involved. So it's got to be, all staff across the university, academics and professional services, and students as well. But I think it's from that perspective of, if we can get that work truly valued across the university, then we get the buy-in. So clearly, loads of staff are very, very hard pushed for time. So with pressures and priorities, we need to be able to give them some kind of steer as to where to prioritise. And obviously, from our perspective at the university, the student experience is at the pinnacle of that in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis, alongside obviously all the research and everything as well. And I think it's important to think about what we're trying to do with the likes of the Global Changemaker framework, and looking at the development of not just the technological know-how that I mentioned, but also the skills within the student's portfolio, if you like. So it is about that whole institution aspect, you know, from all of our support services, all of the academic subject areas. But I think it's, in order to buy staff that time, we have to have buy-in from all levels of the university, from the bottom right up to the top, and so that there is reward and recognition for the work that people do in this area to support our student experience.
Okay, I'll bring these two questions in a minute. Minhyong, first of all, a question to you. Are you asking us to recognise, with your specific example of mathematics, to recognise those biases and those misconceptions, or are you asking us to challenge them today and understand those misperceptions, misconceptions, biases, whatever, and bring them into what we're trying to achieve at Heriot-Watt in the 2020s? And if so, how?
Well, I hope I understood your question.
I'm not sure I did, sorry.
I think in sort of the kind of language we often use today in education, one way of thinking about the questions I'm raising is related to role models. Right? That, of course, something that people regard as very important. And rather recently, I encountered a black student, in fact, who asked me why there are no black mathematicians in the past, especially. Right? And part of my answer is what I said today. In fact, we don't know who these people were. So when we say the mathematics or science is a global enterprise, I think it's very easy to say this in a paternalistic way. Right? And this paternalistic perspective, I feel like, comes basically from ignorance. So the lack of knowledge of, in fact, the accurate versions of history, the complexity of history as it developed over the millennia. So in order to articulate the points we do normally make, but in a way that's backed up by knowledge and conviction, I'm saying we need to study more as academics.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. First of all, one here, and then the one over here. Jill, I'll come to you first because we've just heard that question, then come back to Martha on the bridges. So, yeah.
Not any particular examples, I don't think, but I think it's linked to what Martha was saying about where the flexibility is as well, and what flexes and what doesn't. So what is suitable for one person's learning and not. And I think we need to really, I think there are some simple things we could do actually in terms of how we teach. I think, you know, the clarity of different learning approaches and taking different learning approaches, and especially the clarity around our assessment processes. I think that's huge. I mean, that's the point at which I'm sure many of those of us in the room who teach, you know, will recognise that we might be teaching a class and things seem okay until you get to that assessment point. And one form of assessment certainly doesn't suit all. And I think we're slightly conditioned into formal examinations, for example, because, you know, most people in this room and the students that we teach on a day-to-day basis have come from very formal education systems where the culmination of that was a set of exams, whatever education system it's in. And I think it's thinking about that in a very different way, because there are so many forms of assessment that we could encompass and that would support a diversity of learning styles and a diversity of skills. Everybody's different. Everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. And if we could bring in that wealth of diverse assessment processes, then we can think about not catering to that, but supporting our students in with those different forms of assessments to bring forward their knowledge, to bring forward their skills and develop those skills. So I think from what I'd looked around, it's very much focused on certainly some different ways of teaching, but definitely rethinking how we do those assessment processes, and given that flexibility within that. And some of the research I've been reading recently, there is some suggestion about giving students the choice of assessment that they get at an end of a course, obviously within reason, but so you would have students doing different assessments for the same piece of work.
Okay, thanks very much. And Martha, the bridges question.
The bridges question. So I think it is the question of the moment, and quite an imperative one for us, and particularly in the Scottish context when we're talking about that tertiary move. How do you challenge that, the transactional or the quick moving piece? And it's something which I think the two kind of, your metaphor there of home, John, has two different elements to that. One is we will need to, even the metaphor of the home that you're bringing there, the question of rent, how much it will cost to live in that home, I think is going to be the driving piece, that we want to make it feel like that we belong in a space, that people feel that there's a home there. But I think it's going to be an uphill struggle really to get that in the current context, the fees, the funding, the tariff that we're having to pay to stay in that space for an extended period of time really will be the crux of what we can do here. So if we can begin to look at the fees and the funding and how you can use that creatively to stay in that space, I think it is going to be the critical bit for the next few months that we'll need to be exploring within the Scottish sector and years. The other bit is actually about to make sure people feel that they're at home in that space. And I think Minhyong's work, I think, is fantastic in this space about how kind of to make people feel that they belong within a discipline, they belong in their learning space, they can see themselves in what they're doing. So it's not, if we're thinking about lifelong learning, we're thinking about education as home, as a place that you're truly within, that takes us into a whole range of those different areas. It's not just about the transactional, but the sense of seeing yourself, about feeling that you have a space in that place. So that's a metaphor that we can take away and play with. Do we want less bridges and more homes? I'm not sure whether that will play with the Scottish Government in terms of the decisions they've got to make, but we can certainly offer that one out.
Okay, we'll come to this question here. Can we get the microphone? There's a question at the back. Yeah, we'll come to that one next. So question over here to the right, please. Every question today is a conference. So who wants to have a go at this one? Minhyong and Martha, Jill? Anybody want to bash at that?
I'll kick off.
Yeah, go on, Martha, go for it.
I think it's fascinating. There's two different aspects to what you're saying there, Alex. So the wider history of, and like in so much of the kind of historical piece, it's a lot of our access history in Scotland is seen as a counterpoint to access in south of the border, and there's that kind of interplay, and it's very much, if you look at the Commission on Widening Access, was very much framed in terms of the politics of its time around, so our vision of access very much defined as other to that of the English HE sector. So I think that's something we need to be really aware of. And I guess the point that I was trying to make in my presentation, Minhyong's flagging as well, the politics of this is absolutely critical. And we see it played out not just in the Scottish context, but how we're playing out our visions of access and inclusion in Malaysia, Dubai, and so on. And we need to see that intertwined. The experiential learning piece is one which we really do need to grapple with as an institution. We're seeing that, and I think it's useful for us to reflect back on our history as an institution, think, well, actually, where are we now in valuing experiential learning, of valuing work-based learning, and what does that mean for our future decisions, not just about our curriculum, but about our systems, our processes, and what we set ourselves up to do as an institution. So I think you really hit the nail on the head there about having to look back in order to reflect forward to new things that we can do.
Maybe as I admitted earlier, I don't have nearly the expertise of my colleagues here to reply knowledgeably to a question like this, but I can say something about my personal experience. After I was appointed, I did look up the history of Heriot-Watt and asked people around about the origins of the institution, and I found it very inspiring, and it made clear to me that a lot of the things that we're speaking about today, for example, is not empty rhetoric. As we know, a lot of such discussion can be rhetorical, depending upon the kind of context and institution in which it's articulated, right? But I feel like at Heriot-Watt, because of the nature of the institution, people are able to take it much more seriously.
Okay. Jill, if I can just take one of the points that Martha made in response to that, this whole idea, and you touched on it, about Heriot-Watt having different campuses around the world with different cultural histories, different legal systems, different values to some extent. How desirable is it to have a single Heriot-Watt culture when there may be times where you have to adapt that curriculum to be appropriate in the place in which you're teaching it? How do you maintain that organisational culture but be respectful of those individual cultures in the places where the campuses are sited?
Yeah, I think it's, as I said in the presentation, I think it's about thinking about where are the similarities and parallels that we can build on and have that pure one Heriot-Watt way, if you like, and where we have to recognise that there are differences and factors that we have to be respectful of. So I think we do have that sense of one Heriot-Watt, and we can have the sort of the core ethos, as it were, but recognise, as I say, and respect those differences. So, for example, a very practical instance would be working within a discipline, within a teaching team, and the teaching team teaches across Dubai, Malaysia, Edinburgh, for example, or Dubai, Malaysia, or one of the other Scottish campuses. And obviously, even within a discipline subject, there will be slight differences. Some of linked to what Minhyong was talking about with the history and so on. So you can have that core curriculum for the teaching the discipline subject or the course, but allow for contextualisation within the day-to-day teaching. So obviously respecting, not using examples which may not be relevant in other campuses and so on. So I think it's about, we can have that core, but having that wherewithal to have the adaptability to contextualise our teaching to respect the differences.
Okay, thank you. I'll take the question from the back. Are there any more questions on this side? You've got one here. So question at the back, then question at the front, and then we'll get the microphone over here next, please. Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you. Can you speak in? Yeah, speak. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take this question at the front as well, and then let the panel think about the last one, then we'll have both questions, yeah? Okay, fire away. Okay, thank you. Jill, can you take that last question first again, please, into particularly around meaningful consultation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to your question about consultation is yes. And then I could, you know, I won't stop there, but I could, because I think it's absolutely imperative. I think certainly from what we've been looking at across the sector, and we have to look out across the sector to get good examples and try and work in the best way we possibly can. I think there's a much greater move towards, the phrase I used in the presentation was co-creation. I just think that's at the heart of it. And so that anything that we plan to do and we plan to work on as we go forward has to have that element to it. So, you know, working with different student groups through the student partnership agreement, getting, you know, living those aspects of the SPA and so on. But I think the co-creation aspect is absolutely essential, because, you know, if we think about anything across any part of our lives, unless we have input to it, then it's never necessarily going to work for us. So I think in terms of the consultation aspect, I think it's absolutely imperative, and yeah, that's certainly is the plan.
Okay, and do you want to come back, Martha, on that first question around, is it time for more autonomy in terms of how we approach some of these issues?
I think it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I'm going to answer it in the direct way that you're meaning it, but I think within this space, and it perhaps alludes also to the second question there, the balance of looking at the metrics and the must-dos that we have to do, kind of that, and there is a central institutional piece around that, around targets and fees and funding and so on, that we do need to take an institution-wide perspective on. But there's also an importance of looking at context, and whether that's the context of our disciplines and looking at how we make our disciplines more accessible, our particular pathways that are open in particular for particular subject areas, making those more flexible. We need to be looking at where we need that flex in order to open greater pathways into STEM, for example, or a particular disciplinary need. But we need to do that in a kind of carefully balanced way, making sure that we've got that central piece that needs to, the must-dos now, and then maybe the more radical reframing of how we want to approach things in other ways. So it's things like, for example, if we look at apprenticeships, or we even look at Global College and what we're doing to open space there are things which we'll be able to do at an institutional level that does need institutional change and flexibility. But we also be able to look at the particular disciplinary pathways and what we need to change in our curriculum to make the specific disciplinary aspects more accessible for particular groups, for particular ways of thinking and framing our understandings of knowledge.
Just what you said right at the start, Martha, I think you talked about the gap between the language and the lived reality. And I think that maybe comes back to part of your question, that what's being said by the university isn't necessarily reflective of your own experience of how you're being consulted and included and so on. So I do wonder, Martha, just a question a bit about language, is when we talk about learner journeys or we talk about co-creation, is that sort of educational jargon sometimes a barrier in itself to inclusivity? And do we need to try and make the language a bit more inclusive, the language of inclusivity a bit more inclusive?
Yeah, I would probably go further and say it's that we use the language to push the radical change that we need to see. If we're actually talking, I think the question that was raised by the Disabled Students Association was absolutely the approach you need to take, is to take the language and to drive it and to demand it and to make it happen. And that's where we'll get the radical change. So when we're talking at a sector level about a tertiary approach to post-school education, are we going to push that and push those ideas and make that more authentic and actually turn the rhetoric into reality? Are we going to take our history of experiential work-based learning and actually drive that forward? Are we going to take inclusion and actually make that meaningful? So I think we take the language and we drive it to make the demands for change that we need to see.
Okay, I'm going to take very, very briefly, Minhyong, yep.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I hope I can make it brief. I just wanted to comment about the question that you asked just now, because simply based on experience. So I worked at many institutions and taught many different kinds of students. Once I was tutoring a visually impaired student for 1 year. This was a wonderful experience in many ways. I'm simply trying to draw on that experience to emphasize also the importance of individual commitment in addition to institutional solutions. So faculty, for example, who are dealing with the student, need to commit themselves to support the students in the way that their best guess, or through communication, what they figure out about what the students need, and also be their advocates. In the institution where I was doing this, I found, to be honest, the institutional support was exactly what you said. What they said was one thing, what was provided was appalling, quite frankly. And without individual commitment, I felt like nothing was really going to get done. So I felt like that's something very important for the faculty, for example.
Okay, thank you. Who took the microphone over here? It's going to have to be quite a quick question. Anybody take the microphone over here? No? Any more questions? Yep, sorry. This might have to be the last question, sorry. Yeah. Jill, that's another tough question for you.
That's maybe the one that gets me into trouble. Thanks for that one. I'll try to end on a positive note, but I would have to start by saying I totally agree with you. I think we could, and I think we are moving towards using our data better, and we're also moving towards a position where we have more accessible data. You know, we have that staff can get access, students can get access to that data more easily than we once did, and therefore can see, you know, what the pictures might be and how the, for want of a better word, interventions that we might make might help. I think that we won't get away entirely from metrics. I think we will always be challenged to be meeting targets for certain things, but I think my hope would be that there's a bit of a swing and a focus towards what you're talking about in terms of putting the measures in place and being less bothered about the targets and more bothered about the impact of the measures. And I think that's what we need to use the data for, to do that. And I think that we have to resource those measures and make sure that where we recognise the need, that we're putting that support in place, both for the students and for the staff. Because I suppose it links to what Minhyong was saying. It's very much, you know, we're talking about individuals in a lot of senses. We're talking about individual students. We're also talking about individual staff supporting them. So I think we need to have that network round about us all, where we can get that resource and we can move things forward. And the practitioners group I was talking about, I've found really useful in terms of sharing concerns and sharing best practice across the university. Here's my positive note, sharing that across the university to say, well, what do we think we could do better in that area? Some things might be quite simple changes, and then some things will require us to be speaking to other people about how we actually go about it.
Great, thanks very much. I'm conscious of time, conscious people need to get away, and just before I hand on for the summary, thanks very much to Martha, to Gillian and to Minhyong for some fantastic insights today. And if there's one phrase that stuck in my mind, I think it was that phrase from Martha that I just used. It's the language, the gap between the language and the lived reality. And that sort of talks to the last question as well, in terms of the language that's being used and actually what's going on the ground is quite significant. And maybe we need to take Martha again to build that bridge between that language and that lived reality. But thanks very much to the panel, and I'm just going to hand over now to Professor Sara Lombardo, Executive Dean for the School of Mathematical and Computer Sciences, for a few final words. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Sara Lombardo. I am a mathematician, and I can certainly resonate with some of the themes that we have been tackling today, thanks to our three professors, incredible really discussions and panelists. Throughout my journey, but also through the work I do nationally in driving diversity and inclusion in the mathematical sciences, so very close, and I had many discussions with Minhyong. I am aware that I am between you and the drinks, so I'll keep it very short. This is really for me the key questions for any higher education institution. And the language, as Martha reminded us, is really crucial. Yes, we have moved away from the deficiency model. I'm not too sure that the language has really evolved enough. We still talk about gaps. We still talk about bridging in a positive way, but we often forget the richness that we have through diversity, through the experiences that are not the standard, the one of the vast majority, but that richness that people with different characteristic experiences, lived experiences, cultures, as we heard through in Jill reflections. So we definitely have challenges that do modulate depending on the culture the people bring in. We are multicultural, we are a global institution. So we always look at the challenges, never at the positive, at the richness that experience brings in. So I think language is key. There is a lot that we can do and constantly educate ourselves in capturing the positive values, together with the challenges that we rightly have to address, sharing and co-creating with the people that live those challenges. And this really goes across diversity. It encapsulates also socioeconomic diversity, as well as disability, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. Another point that was very important for me is made by Gillian, was raising aspirations. And this is something I see a lot, particularly in the UK. There is too often barriers that are imposed to the younger generation too early. Too often, and this brings me to what Minhyong really proposed us, namely stereotypes and misconception, in a sense, bring people away from, for example, studying certain subjects or believing that they can achieve or reach out in certain part of our society. So we have, as an higher education institution, it's our duty to challenge those misconceptions and those stereotypes, really. And we have seen, I think Minhyong gave a fantastic account of how this plays on in mathematics. Mathematics is exclusive, and it doesn't need to be, because mathematics really belongs to those that are interested. But I'm sure that the vast majority of you possibly grew up with the fear of mathematics. I mean, either you loved it, otherwise you felt excluded from a fantastically fascinating and creative human activity. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's discussion as much as I did. I really think there is a lot for every one of us to take home and feel, if you are in a higher education, wherever your daily work brings you, there is a lot for us to contribute to this agenda much more widely and in the society. So I please join me in thanking all the 3 fantastic speakers and the chair for having presented this fantastic discussion. So thank you very much, colleagues.